This won't be a spoiler review since I feel like there isn't a major rush for people to see this show, and the good word of mouth surrounding Andor is slowly bringing more attention to it. Within Andor's praise, you have probably heard that this is the best Star Wars content in a long time, and technically, that is true, but to be fair, there isn't a lot of competition. The Book of Boba Fett was pretty bad, Obi-Wan was a nightmare behind the scenes and on screen, and The Mandalorian is good at times, but it has its own issues. Andor is a clear standout in quality, however, don't go in expecting a magnum opus that is going to blow your socks off. This is a slow-paced show that takes its time with characters and plot progression, and everything it sets out to achieve is done superbly and pretty much flawlessly. This show is a spy thriller with a big emphasis on drama, and with that kind of emphasis, you need to create a colorful cast of characters. Ironically, out of all the Star Wars content, Andor has the most interesting ensemble, which is really sad considering Obi-Wan just came out and that show is so dull in terms of character work. For Andor, we have Cassian, who's a good POV character for the audience, since he's getting ushered into this new rebel world. He feels very compelling because he's so reluctant to join the cause and is instead swayed by his own motivations. He's not blindly joining the rebels for unknown reasons that the writers don't elaborate on, but he acts realistically to serve himself. This in turn makes the plot a bit unpredictable because it doesn't go down that stereotypical path of the protagonist turning into an immediate good guy. Then the supporting cast I think is rock solid, and there are even some Game of Thrones alumni who show up like Lord Royce, The Waif, and Qyburn, who all do an excellent job, as well as some other notable supporting characters like Ebon Moss, and I'm not sure how to say his last name, who was amazing in The Bear, and Andy Serkis. I adore Andy Serkis, and I really hope he gets more live action work because this man can act, and he had an engrossing monologue that's filled with so much emotion. Then this isn't even getting into the best part of the cast, which is Stellan Skarsgard. If this guy chooses a project, then I'm immediately interested in it, given that he's been on a hot streak. And if he's choosing Andor of all shows to be in, then there has to be a reason. He is a world-class actor, and any line of dialogue he delivers is done with so much weight and gravitas. His character in the show is by far the most engaging because he's at the center of the rebellion, so any plot development around him is always riveting. This also ties into Mon Mothma because she's also at the center of the rebellion Big Bang. Every scene she is in has so much tension because she has to act very carefully so she doesn't set off any red flags. This ties in a more political and scheming aspect to the show that it kind of shares with Game of Thrones. It actually makes the conflict of starting the Rebel Network a surprising delight because of how difficult it is here. Characters don't just snap their fingers and spawn in allies like in the movies, because that actually takes time and lots of hard work. This is where the meat of Andor is, and since the writing is really well done, it excels in these dramatic aspects. Probably because the show is being passionately made by Tony Gilroy, who also wrote Rogue One and the Bourne trilogy, so the man is goated. This is not a case of Obi-Wan where Disney forces it into existence and butchers the original direction of the story to fill the miniseries format. So the fact that this show both has a great and solid direction from a creative leader who is dedicated to the project, and great actors who want to be in this show speaks volumes for the quality of Andor. Along with the fact that this actually feels like a feature-length show. Because Disney Plus shows have been gaining the reputation of being like 30 minutes long once you disregard the intro and outro. Andor has a few episodes of that duration, but most of them are about 40 to 50 minutes long. So that's another sign that the creators are putting care into the story instead of rushing to a conclusion. There is no filler like the endless amount of side quests in The Mandalorian and half of the Book of Boba Fett being flashbacks. Andor follows different perspectives in this expansive universe, and it all intertwines in a glorious fashion. Now going into this show, it starts out pretty slow and I honestly had a hard time getting through the first 2 episodes, given that they had to set up a lot of material like dozens of characters, background and motivations, and Cassian's backstory. The plot wasn't that engaging at that point, but it evolves and becomes more interesting once Cassian becomes entangled with the rebels. The second he gets into a room with Stellan Skarsgard's character, it becomes really fun. So if you do decide to try the show, at least get to episode 3 because the first 3 episodes have one big arc. And the other mini plot arcs that Cassian goes down get even better. Also, Andor doesn't appeal to people who want constant action and lightsaber battles. It has action in small quantity, and the show earns it by properly building it up and having extremely satisfying payoff. As an example, Cassian meets a crew of people and they decide to do a heist. And instead of having a fast pace where right after meeting them they cut to the mission, Cassian instead has to learn the operation and in turn meets the characters. Everyone is very fleshed out because of this, and they all have compelling backstories. So when we inevitably get to the action, which is also really well done from a writing standpoint and a visual standpoint, we actually care about these people. Another big aspect of the show in terms of plot and writing is that there isn't a constant barrage of terrible mistakes. There's no Leia getting chased through the woods by bounty hunters who can't catch her, or characters surviving getting skewered by a lightsaber. Andor feels realistic and grounded, and there's nothing in the writing department that compromises that feeling. Because of this and the more slow pace, the show feels significantly more gritty and foreboding. And since we are slowing down, the writers also give the villains over in the Empire a lot of screen time. At first, I was kind of scared these scenes would be dull since it's a bunch of old people talking about security and politics, but that isn't the case. The rendition of the Empire here is very competent and makes them seem much more menacing because they are constantly on the heels of our heroes and tracking them. That's why these scenes are so engaging, because they are directly tied to the plot, they're setting up new and interesting characters, there's even conflict amongst the ranks to add even more spice, and it's actively intriguing because we never seen this kind of meticulous detail before in Star Wars. That's one major aspect about the show that I love so much, because Star Wars has such a rich and immersive universe, but because of bad past writers on different projects, they essentially squander the potential of the IP, and it becomes very bland as a result. Tony Gilroy brings in that much needed feeling of depth and fully explores everything tied to the Rebels, the Empire, and how each planet is being impacted. Thankfully, this detail within the world builds the Empire's stronger antagonists and doesn't portray them as buffoons. It makes them feel like a real and tangible threat that is pursuing our heroes, which thankfully, there isn't an annoying amount of stormtroopers constantly missing to make the villain unantagonizing, like in Obi-Wan. Because when shit goes down, some characters you come to like will die. The show in that regard isn't afraid of killing characters, and that's refreshing because it doesn't give off the notion of plot armor that destroys any semblance of tension. It makes the action significantly more intense despite us knowing that Cassian will survive until the events of Rogue One. We don't know the outcome of different side characters and how certain story elements will play out. That's why the show has to establish likable characters, and they do that expertly. Going into a more technical and production point of view for Andor, the show still doesn't show any flaws. For starters, every set piece is really refreshing and is much needed since almost every show so far has been set in the dullness of Tatooine. Like, we have a mining planet that is being destabilized by the Empire, a more mountainous planet that looks like the best parts of Scotland, Coruscant is back, and all the interiors for the Empire are so eerie and corporate and is so devoid of life given that everything is washed out in white, essentially contrasting the rest of the production design in the show. This was really the first time that I've been impressed by the sets for Disney Plus Star Wars content, and I'm happy that they are giving the show a bigger sense of scale than The Mandalorian as an example. If they were using the volume regularly, then they easily fooled me because it looks like they are using practical locations and using VFX as a form of set extension. I tend to prefer this more because it makes the world feel tangible when you really build it. It's infinitely more impressive to me and is awe-inspiring. The volume used well can blend into an already existing collection of good sets, but when you primarily use the volume, it can become a little noticeable. For the VFX, this isn't a show that requires a lot of it since there isn't a big action set piece in every episode, so it's primarily used to ground us in the world through environments. Disney is not sparing any expense, and the VFX is very immersive because it brings a staggering amount of quality to the details of each world. And even when there is an emphasis on VFX, like this TIE fighter flying overhead, it's very realistic. Like, watch this brief clip. Through the interaction with the environment and the characters being scared to death and being deafened by the loud noises, establishes this as being real. Then when the show decides to go big with VFX, it really blows you away with the striking visual design. Andor is just a beautiful show, and even the cinematography doesn't miss a single beat. The show hooked me really early on with this long take focused on a close-up of Cassian's face as he's being pestered by two officers. It immediately allowed Diego Luna to impress us with his great acting, and it was a very bold shot. So right away, the show establishes a high bar for cinematography. The music is also a major standout as well. This isn't like Obi-Wan, where you probably have no memory of what the main theme was, because here it's very memorable. The composer for Andor is also the same composer for Succession, and the main theme for that show is iconic. So to say the least, he brings just as much talent to Andor. I particularly love the emphasis being put on violins, and it gives a lot of the music within the soundtrack such a beautiful and uplifting, endearing feeling. It portrays the notion of breaking free of tyranny and gaining freedom. Each episode opens with a long logo of Andor, and honestly, I haven't skipped one because I immediately am put into a wonder-like trance by the music. That, and the soundtrack goes down some interesting routes, and the composer, Nicholas Brittle, even tries out a more synth style at times. It's a very refreshing soundtrack, and it's pretty close to The Mandalorian in terms of quality. The Mandalorian to me in terms of music is still my favorite, but that's because Ludwig Göransson is one of my favorite composers. So yeah, everything within the show, from the acting, character work, writing, different and fun story arcs, tone, tense atmosphere, and everything on the production side of the coin is done with so much expertise to the point that it deserves to be watched. This is a show made with so much passion and care put into the story. It may not have characters people love going in to immediately sell it, but it does a magnificent job of creating a rich roster of characters that you will easily come to love. I was very hesitant going into the show, but I ended up binge watching it in almost one sitting. Thank you for watching, and let me know if you guys have been enjoying Andor.